Welcome to Unit 7 of Philosophy in Film, which is about interpretation. The two readings that we'll be discussing are both from this book, the Routledge Companion to Philosophy in Film. And the first one is by George Wilson, and it's about interpretation, which is the major topic of this unit. So previous units, especially, for example, last unit on personal identity, have been basically philosophy through film. That is, the ideas that we're interested in about theories of personal identity are philosophical ideas, and the films are just useful illustrations of different theories. So it's not really looking at the films as films, they're just sort of vehicles for ideas, good illustrations. Whereas this unit, finally, is explicitly philosophy of film. That is, we're looking at what it is, we're looking at films themselves as the subject matter of the philosophy. Rather than films merely as vehicles for ideas, we're looking at films themselves. So what we want to address in this unit is, what are the ground rules, what are the guidelines for interpreting a movie or a set of movies? Which, of course, we do all the time. We ask, what was that movie about? What are we supposed to get from that movie? And in fact, I've chosen in this unit several movies that are notoriously puzzling, that are open to multiple interpretations. And also, because there's no specific theme that was governing the choice of movies, as in past units, so, children, the movies have to be about children and so on. Because there's no theme that restricts it, I was able to pick just amazing or incredibly highly regarded movies, irrespective of their subject matter. So as I say in the introduction on Blackboard, some of the movies picked here are regarded as among the best movies ever. There's 7 from the list that are in a list of the top 50 movies ever made, which is pretty high praise, and probably if you watch a couple of them you'll be underwhelmed given the praise, but hey, that's the critical reaction, including the current favorite, which is Hitchcock's Vertigo. So, how are we to interpret movies? What is it that we are supposed to base an interpretation on? If I say that movie was about this, how can I justify saying that? That's what Wilson's chapter Interpretation is about. Now, it begins by referencing a famous 1966 article by the critic Susan Sontag called Against Interpretation. And in that essay, she says, interpretations that select a set of elements and claims that each of the elements in, say, a movie or a work of art in general, like a novel, and claims that each of those elements means this or stands for this. She says that is a misguided enterprise. And this was a very influential essay and caused sort of a change in thought about how we should interpret movies and, literature in general. Now, what Wilson says is, well, maybe this article shouldn't have been seen as so revolutionary, because she seems to have a view of interpretation as if it's translation. That is, we take a work of art, a movie or a novel or whatever, and we rewrite or we represent it in the form of our interpretation. It's as if we're taking something and we're translating it into a language that we understand. So just as in regular translation, if there's a passage in a language I don't understand, I get it translated nowadays by Google Translate, so it turns out terrible, but I get it translated into a way that I can understand it. So the interpretation is something we can understand, and it's supposed to in some way represent the original. That view of interpretation, he said, that had already been called into question. But, so either Sontag's article wasn't as revolutionary as it was made out to be, or it goes too far, because if we take interpretation more broadly and not meant as simply translation, he says that we can defend a kind of interpretation. So we can defend the behavior of people like critics who like to say, here's what that movie was all about, or here's what, here's the true message of such and such. So he says, Wilson says, look, interpretation, first of all, can't be avoided. We can't avoid in some way trying to make sense of particularly troubling movies or confusing movies. I mean, if you watch, for example, 2001, Mulholland Drive, Persona, Rashomon, any of those, and Vertigo as well, there's some elements in there where you think, what is going on here? What does that mean? Why did that happen? We can't help doing that. We've got to make sense of things. So we can't really avoid interpretation. And if you're going to say all interpretation is worthless, then, it seems to undermine a great chunk of human behavior. But also another value is that it helps in understanding the movie. I mean, we want to understand something, and interpretation enables us to do that. And surely there are better interpretations than others. Here's an example that just occurred to me. There are, in the New Testament, the Christian Bible's New Testament, there are a number of parables that Jesus is supposed to have given. And they require interpretation because, and this is slightly infuriating, they're not clear. He doesn't say, here, I'm just going to tell you some guidelines for living. Instead, he gives you these stories and doesn't tell you what they're about. So, of course, people ever since have interpreted them. And a very famous one is the Good Samaritan. Now, I am amazed to discover that some people aren't familiar with this. But, okay, brief summary. A rich man is traveling and he gets mugged and left to die by the side of the road. All his goods are taken and he's beaten up horribly and dumped by the side of the road. And people keep coming by and sort of avoiding him. They don't help him. People of his own tribe avoid him until along comes a Samaritan who is a member of a different tribe and supposedly a rival tribe to his own. And yet the Samaritan picks him up, helps him, takes him to a hotel, or the ancient Middle East equivalent, and pays for his healthcare and so on. Okay, what are we to make of this? Clearly it seems to be about, I say clearly, but maybe that's biasing my interpretation. It seems to be about the value of being good to strangers. I remember in the 80s, when I was growing up, Mrs. Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, who was a Prime Minister of Britain who was particularly right-wing, interpreted this as a parable about the value of capitalism and free enterprise, because she said the only way that the Samaritan was able to help the guy who'd been left by the side of the road was because the Samaritan was wealthy and had become wealthy through a free enterprise system. Okay, that's an interpretation of the story, which I think is a terrible one. But if unless there are some guidelines for interpretation, who's to say which is better than the other? But it seems to me that that's the quitter's attitude, and a very implausible attitude, to say that there are no guidelines, that no interpretation. Note my Hitchcockian lighting today. I'm going for the stylistic effects. Hitchcock likes to do very stark lighting, and also we saw that in film noir. So I thought, what does it mean, you might ask? That's up to you to interpret. Anyway, it seems to me, and I think what Wilson is saying, is that it's just not the case that any interpretation is okay. It's not, whatever you want. There must be some guidelines. There must be some way to say that one interpretation is just better than another. Okay, so how are we to do this? Well, first, Wilson introduces an influential philosopher of film, David Bordwell's. He divides ways of understanding. So we're interested in understanding films, but this is a sort of broader categorization of understanding into 3 elements. The first element is comprehension. Now, comprehension is just literal, understanding what is happening on the screen, saying that so it's the kind of thing you explain to your grandma when she wakes up in the middle of a show and says, what's happening, who's that person. So comprehension is, well, that person is that person's father, and he's mad at him because of, he wrecked the car or whatever. So it's making sense of the surface events. So, for example, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, you could say, well, that person is a member of a different tribe from that person. It's explaining literally what's going on in the parable. But, of course, this is distinct from what lesson are we supposed to learn from these sort of surface events. So, number 1 is just comprehension of overt, explicit meanings. Like the literal, it's an analog to the literal meaning of words in a piece of writing. Whereas, contrast that with what Bordwell calls explicative interpretation. So if comprehension is the explicit meaning, the literal meaning, the explicative interpretation is looking for what is called implicit meanings, sort of the message, the hidden meanings, the meanings that are there for you to get when you truly get it. And this is going to be the focus of Wilson's attention in this piece. Bordwell gives a third kind of understanding, which is symptomatic. And this is more like, and the word symptomatic gives you a clue, it's like psychological interpretation. So you've probably seen interpretations of works where they explain someone's behavior not the way that they personally understand it, but as a result of psychological drives. Freud, for example, would say, oh, that's his repressed sexual urges explain that kind of behavior. So it's not an explanation that's available to the characters. It's not the explanation they would give for their behavior. It's the true psychological causal drives. Now, symptomatic could be not just psychological forces, it could be social, cultural, so on. Like the forces of global capitalism are what drove this person to do such and such. On page 164, Wilson gives an example of this. Laura Mulvey says, Laura Mulvey argues that certain fundamental features of narrative and its presentation in classic Hollywood films are muted manifestations of unconscious and pathological male fascination and anxiety engendered in contemplating the erotically charged female body. Okay, this is all, so she has a sort of theory of forces at work that she applies to explain all kinds of different things. Marxists are famous for giving interpretations of literature in terms of what Marx identified as the sort of economic drivers of history. That's very much sort of a view of explanation that I don't know, it had its day. It sort of flourished for a while, but is not so much in fashion anymore. And I think that's for the best. I mean, it seems to be a one-size-fits-all. It's like when Marxists, I remember in the 80s, when the apartheid regime was still in control in South Africa. I went to an anti-apartheid conference, and there was a small subgroup of Marxists there who wanted to say, this isn't about racism, this is about capitalism. That's what explains apartheid. And I get it. I think, there's a lot to be said for Marxist analysis, but, the apartheid regime was about racism. It was driven by black versus white. So to say that, it's not about racism, because I understand the true drivers, the true forces at work, and they're economic, it's always, too simplifying, I think. So the symptomatic form of understanding is not one that Wilson is going to get into. The one he's going to focus on is the explicative interpretation, where we go beyond the mere surfaced events to explain what the surfaced events are supposed to signify. What do they mean? So meaning seems to be important. All right, and it's the implicit meanings. Okay, so Bordwell gives two conditions for implicit meanings, and this is on page 164. First of all, for something to count as the implicit meaning of a film, one, it is not overtly expressed in the film. In other words, it's not, the characters don't talk about it. It's not like, so the implicit meaning of, say, a heist movie is not the heist itself, because that's right there on the surface. It would be, an implicit meaning would more likely to be the tragic effects of greed on human behavior, the ultimately tragic results of, the relentless pursuit of getting ahead, something like that. So it's not overtly expressed. All right, the second condition that he gives, remember this is Bordwell, not necessarily Wilson, is that there must be some kind of general or abstract or thematic point. So in other words, there's a larger lesson. It's not specific to the individuals involved, say. It's not saying, oh, that person was greedy, so they shouldn't have been greedy. A true implicit meaning, we're going to learn a lesson that is broader than that, like people shouldn't, or more general or universal. Now Bordwell says that, Wilson says that there is a model of film interpretation which agrees with these first two, that implicit meaning is not overtly expressed and it's general and abstract or thematic. And the exegetical model of film interpretation agrees with these two ideas and adds a third claim, that there are objective facts about what parts of a film mean, and an interpretation has to uncover these. Now, it's important that they're objective. In other words, this is very much not relativistic. In other words, if there are objective facts about what a film means, it must be the case that someone who offers an interpretation that doesn't talk about those, it'll be a bad interpretation. They're missing the point. So you can't just come up with any meaning. There is a meaning, or there are meanings to certain parts of the film, and they're there to be found. And an interpretation is better the more that it picks out the things that are really there, the meanings that are really there. So, for example, I might claim that Mrs. Thatcher's interpretation of the Good Samaritan misses what is really there. What is really there, and I could say, look, why is it important that it's a Samaritan? They're members of a different tribe. Your interpretation ignores that. That's clearly important. That's an important fact that a good interpretation has to acknowledge. Okay, so that's the exegetical model of film interpretation. That is, an interpretation has to get the implicit meaning that is really there. Now, there are challenges to this version of interpretation, this view of what film interpretation should do. One challenge, talked about on page 165, is to reject the third claim, that there are objective facts. And you might ask, what do you mean objective facts? It's not as if features of a film are like rocks in the ground, that they're really there to be dug up. How can you say that some feature of a film that you pick out is objectively meaningful. You're saying that it's meaningful, but you can't say that it has meaning that you're responding to. Aren't you instead projecting meaning onto it? Aren't you saying, oh, I'm going to pick this as significant? Like, for example, I mean, people do this with texts all the time. There is a very small sect of Christians who are snake handlers. I think this is in Appalachia somewhere that these people predominate, that there are still churches that do this, where they talk about handling, where a test of faith is that you handle a snake and are not bitten. Why does this sect exist? Because there is a line in the Bible about snakes and biting, and they really fixated on this idea. They say, I have found the significant section of the Bible. The rest of that stuff, Ten Commandments and all that business, yeah, it's important, but not as important as this snake bit right here. And, similarly, people who obsess about homosexuality, it's really important to them to focus on one particular section of Leviticus or whatever the section is in the New Testament that talks about man lying with man as with a woman. That's the important one. That's above all else. It seems like they're saying, I found the objectively significant part of the Bible that you all have ignored. Whereas what I think critics would say is, no, you've just randomly selected something that you already thought was important. You looked for it, said, oh, here it is, and then you've projected importance to it. So that's a challenge to the exegetical model, is to how can you, to question how you can come up with an objective meaning. How can you claim that it's objective? So this challenge would say, an aspect of a film if it has meaning at all, it's only because, what are the options? Suppose you say that it does have meaning. Where does the meaning come from? And here we are introduced to an idea of the source of meaning, which is actual intentionalism. So actual intentionalism, that's related to our second article, authorship. Some of the ideas recur. Because authorship, the article by Meskin, is about the idea that there is someone who stands in relation to a film exactly the way that an author stands in relation to a work of fiction. Obviously, they're in the driving seat, they're creating it. So actual intentionalism says there's someone who does that for a film. And if there is meaning in a film, it's because that person put it there and intended to put it there. In other words, actual intentionalism treats a movie as if it's like a sort of more complex version of a warning sign. If I put up a warning sign, I intend the sign to get you to do something. I want you to get one particular thing from the sign, like don't. I remember there was a sign I grew up in the country, and there was a sign actually near my grand's house that said, if you can cross this field in 30 seconds, don't. The bull can cross it in 20. That's a more complicated warning sign than most. I mean, normally warning signs are a little bit more direct than that. So the action intentionalism says the meaning of a film is like that. It's as if the creator of the film says, I want them to get this out of it, so I'm going to put it into the film for them to find. That would explain why there are objective facts, but they're sort of not objective in the way that rocks are there, but they are, if we want to say there's meaning to be found in a movie, it's a fairly obvious theory to say that the meaning must have been put there by the creator of the movie. All right, but there are critics of this idea of actual intentionalism. First is that how would the critic, if you say that there is meaning and it's put there by the filmmaker, maybe the filmmaker's dead. How does the critic know? I mean, we can't say that's the meaning that I know that that's the meaning that the creator of the film intended, unless we can actually ask them. And suppose they're not around anymore. So if they're not around anymore, I can never say that that's the meaning because I don't have access to the author's intentions, the creator's intentions. Furthermore, suppose, so that that means that the creator having those intentions is not enough to support a particular interpretation, because we're getting the interpretation from the movie, not from the intentions. And there are ways in which we could get it wrong. We might think we might get the wrong things out of it, or they might have intended to put a message in there and just failed. They made a bad movie, or it's like making a confusing warning sign. They said something they didn't mean to say, and so there's no meaning there to be found. So even if they had the intentions, that doesn't explain that the meaning is there in the movie, because they just might have failed to implant the meaning. And the third and perhaps major criticism of this actual intentionalism is something that Meskin gets into in more detail, is that films are not like warning signs. Warning signs are created by one person. Films are obviously collaborative. Now, not all films, as Meskin points out, they very early films are the product of one person. And for example, remember the movie The Florida Project was made by, I think, Sean Baker is his name. Well, his first movie, he shot with an iPhone. Now, even then, though, he had to get actors. He told actors what to do. So even then, even in that case where he's the cinematographer and the director, he's holding the phone and he's putting it where he wants. And presumably he also wrote the script to the extent that it was scripted. He still has to get the actors to do what he wants, and the actors will put their own little wrinkle on things and do things that he didn't have in mind before, but he liked, so he keeps. So even in cases where it's seems to be the closest to authorship, where just one person is in control, it's still a collaborative enterprise. Now, so those are the criticisms of actual intentionalism. However, actual intentionalism is behind something that again is mentioned a lot in the Meskin article, which is called Auteur Theory. Now, auteur is the French for author, and this is very much an idea put forward, for one, by Francois Truffaut, who directed The 400 Blows, and one of the other movies in the children's section, which is, I'm blanking, but the one that wasn't available online. Oh, Pocket Money, that's right, L'Agent de Poche. Truffaut wrote for a very influential French movie interpretation magazine called Cahiers de Cinéma, as did a lot of the new wave people like Jean-Luc Godard and Jacques Rivette. And Truffaut in particular propounded this thing called the Auteur Theory, which was very influential. It put forward the idea that you really should focus on the director. Up to that point, and this has certainly caught hold, because we do talk about directors a great deal now. We talk about a Spike Lee movie, we talk about a David Lynch movie, we talk about a Jordan Peele movie, as if the movies are products of the one person, the director. Up to that point, when Auteur Theory was propounded, the director wasn't necessarily that important. It's kind of like what happened with comics. In the early days of Marvel Comics, and DC was like this, they didn't have the names of the writers or the artists on the comics. It was just about the stories. It was a Superman comic. Never you mind who wrote it and who drew it. It's a Superman comic. Whereas from the early days of Marvel, Stan Lee really promoted himself, and also Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, the main early artists. And so now, people, the writers and artists of comics are almost as famous as the characters, like Alan Moore, for example, is a superstar comic writer. So that's something that parallels what the Auteur Theory did to directors. Up to that point, people just thought of films as films, or as products of studios, like an MGM movie or a Universal movie. Think of the Universal horror movies. the fact that they're universal horror movies like Dracula, Frankenstein, and so on, Creature from the Black Lagoon, it was more important that they were from that one studio than who directed it. And of course, they were different directors. But then later on, people look back and said, oh, the director of Frankenstein is particularly amazing, this James Whale guy. And now, indeed, there was a movie made about James Whale called Gods and Monsters. Okay, so Auteur Theory is very much committed to the idea that movies are like texts produced by an author. So to understand what a movie is about, ask the director. The director is in charge of giving that movie any meaning that it has. So if you find meaning in there, it will have been put there by the director. Now, against Auteur Theory and actual intentionalism, consider, for example, a character's speech in a movie. The Auteur Theory says, well, that's sort of just an extension of the director. So if a character says something in a movie, then it's the director that you should thank for that. But what about actors? I mean, as is well known, people talk about certain, like a David Lynch movie, but they also talk about like a Tom Cruise movie or a Julia Roberts movie was the example in the book, or a Marlon Brando movie or a Toshiro Mifune movie. I just read something. Toshiro Mifune is, as you know, one of my favorite actors. He was the samurai in Yojimbo, and also he's the bad guy, or presented as the bad guy in Rashomon, and he's in a whole bunch of movies by Akira Kurosawa. And they eventually had a parting of the ways where they argued with each other. And I read that Mifune was in an American movie with what's his name? Lee Marvin, and it was called Death in the Pacific or something, where I think Lee Marvin and Mifune are like an American soldier and a Japanese soldier who have to share a raft together to survive. And the director, John Boorman, had the hell of a time working with Mifune, so he just wouldn't take direction. And then apparently later, Akira Kurosawa said to Boorman, yeah, you don't direct Mifune. You just point him in the right direction like a missile. And then, he does his thing. And people say the same about, Marlon Brando and so on. They bring their own thing to a movie. So actors like that definitely threaten the idea of the auteur. Of course, Hitchcock, who is one of the major figures that were lauded by the auteur theory, one of the famous things that Hitchcock said is that actors are like cattle. So in other words, that sort of bolsters the idea that he's in charge. He makes them do what he wants, and he says, just follow the text. The Coen brothers are supposed to be like this. For example, I saw Jeff Bridges talking about The Big Lebowski, and, it sounds very loose and improvised if you watch the movie, because of, particularly the dude, the character appears, stoned half the time and talks in this surfer kind of talk. Beach bum talk, but every single word of that was scripted, and the Coen brothers politely but firmly insisted that they say every single one. So every fuck meant something, and you couldn't miss one out. So that again, that supports the idea of the auteur theory. But what about the screenwriter? Look at a couple of movies that I included in the last unit, Personal Identity, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and Being John Malkovich. Now, they're the product of two very different directors, but they're very similar because they're both scripts by Charlie Kaufman, who is a very quirky writer who has his own view and is widely regarded as a genius scriptwriter. And has actually gone on to direct his own scripts now. Most recent one was a weird animated one, stop-motion animated one called Anomalisa, which I almost included in this one, but I didn't in the end. Yeah, so those movies have a lot more in common than, for example, Charlie, the Being John Malkovich has with the movie made of Where the Wild Things Are, which is another Spike Jonze movie, or Her, which is another Spike Jonze movie. So Her has less in common with Being John Malkovich than Being John Malkovich has with Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. So it seems like the obvious author in that case is Charlie Kaufman, not Spike Jonze or Michel Gondry, who directed Eternal Sunshine. Other important figures, the editor. You're always hearing, for example, about a director who makes a movie and then quarrels with the studio and they take it over and they recut it. And in recutting it, destroy it so that the director says, screw it, I want my name taken off it. Famously, if you see a movie that has as the director Alan Smithee, what that means is that the director renounced the movie and wanted his name taken off it, his or her name taken off it. So obviously editing is very important, because after all, what the editor is using is stuff that was produced by the director, but in editing it together, they produce a different thing. And actually, if you want to see this editing reworking the message of a movie to humorous effect, there are these competitions where people use editing software to produce a trailer for a movie that is of a different genre from the real movie. So, for example, they did this with Mary Poppins. They took the original Mary Poppins, which of course is a children's movie, and they recut it so that it was the trailer for a horror movie called The Children. And they took actual scenes from the movie, and of course they added kind of sinister music, and they made it so that it looked like the children in Mary Poppins were like some psycho, Children of the Corn type children who were menacing Mary Poppins, and she was the victim. And it's very clever and very funny. And actually, one that makes me laugh out loud is they did this with Jaws. They took Jaws and they turned it into a feel-good story about a singing shark. I've got to find that for you, the Song Shark or something, because it's absolutely hilarious, and it's played for laughs, like one of those Disney animal movies that used to be on Saturday morning TV. So they're using scenes from the movie, but merely by putting them in a different context and putting different music over them, it changes the meaning. So it seems like the editor and the person who scores the movie has a great deal to do with meaning. Like, for example, it's often the case that the only way you understand what a scene is supposed to be is by listening to the music. You know when a scene is supposed to be scary because the music gets scary. You know when it's supposed to be funny because you get jaunty little music and so on. So clearly the person who scores it has a great deal to do with the meaning that we find. All right, so all of those are reasons to question this idea that there's a sole author whose intentions produce it. In reaction to these criticisms, there was a theory called hypothetical intentionalism. So the original theory says actional intentionalism, the meaning of a movie is to be found in the intentions of the person who made it. Now the question is, who's that person? And that's what Meskin addresses. But hypothetical intentionalism says that it's not, because no one person is responsible for every aspect of the movie. The composer does something, the actors do something, the directors does something, and so on. The editor does something, and all of these people are different. There's no one person that we can say produced it. But on the other hand, it's definitely true that a movie seems to have a unified perspective. They've produced this single work, this movie. So these many different people have collaborated to produce this thing, and the thing itself has a single message. So who produced the message? Some kind of hypothetical, implied filmmaker. It's as if, so what we pretend is that there is this sort of godlike figure who embodies all of the people who work together to produce it, as if they were a single, multi-talented individual, and that implied hypothetical filmmaker is the source of the meaning. On page 167 it says, the sequence of movie expresses certain content. Content just means meaning. A message. A content is like a message, like the content of an email is what it's about. So a sequence of a movie expresses content C if the film as a whole makes it maximally plausible to imagine an implied filmmaker intended that content to the attentive audience. Now that to the attentive audience is important because sometimes there's stuff that most viewers overlook, but that if you know what to look for, you see it, and there's no mistake that it was intentional. Like Easter eggs, these things called Easter eggs that are now dotted throughout movies, like particularly Pixar movies. They like to put references to previous movies in their movies. Like you'll see little in Toy Story, they'll have little figurines of previous movies, or even coming movies, like you'll have a little stuffed Dory from Finding Dory or something. So it has to be to an intentive audience. So it isn't just, what everybody would see. Now, so there's this idea that, so therefore there is something to be found in a movie, and we can, the source of the meaning is this implied filmmaker. But the minute you sort of, so the reason why you would say this is because of the problems with the actual intentionalism theory. But does this really solve the problems? Because after all, what justifies the audience in imagining that the intended filmmaker did this? So suppose I say, oh, I know what this movie is saying, according to this theory, my justification for saying that is that it's saying this thing because an implied filmmaker put it in the movie. But what justifies me in saying that the implied filmmaker did it? There isn't really this person. It might be that nobody who actually worked on the movie had that intention. But according to the implied filmmaker, well, that doesn't matter. It's like my parts of my body don't know what the other parts of my body are doing, but we all work together as a unit. So my hand helps in making something, but it doesn't understand it. So the director helped in producing this movie without necessarily understanding it, according to this theory. What if we know, and suppose, for example, we interview every single actual person who worked on this movie, and none of them has the interpretation that we're putting forward. The hypothetical intentionalist could say that doesn't matter, because it's not the actual people that produce the meaning, it's the implied filmmaker. And this is sort of like the wisdom of a crowd. The crowd working together. No individual person understands what they're doing, but the crowd as a whole definitely has something that they're doing. Anyway, one suggestion about how they could produce this is this idea of manifest meaning. That's on page 167. Now, manifest meaning is actually anti-intentionalism about meaning. Now, anti-intentionalism says that you can have meaning without anybody intending it. That is, that the meaning of something doesn't involve what someone intended. Let me give you an example. We had a job in Arkansas before we moved to Flint, which was why moving to Flint wasn't such a bad thing, because we were leaving Arkansas. And while we were there, we had it was before we had kids, and we had a Korean exchange student come and live in our house, because he wanted to live with an American family. Well, it was half American. And so because he was just living in a dorm with other Koreans, believe it or not, there are Korean students living in Arkansas. and he wasn't learning English like he wanted to. So he asked if he could come live in a house, and we said, sure, you can come stay in our spare room. So he did. He was a very nice guy called Dong Wu. And his English did improve in the semester that he stayed with us. But I remember one time he was in a study group with this Arkansas girl from Arkansas who he rather had a crush on. And he wanted to show her that he had a grasp of American idioms. So he reported to us proudly, he said to her, because she was late or she was slow, he said, "Make it crappy," meaning, of course, make it snappy. But so his intention was to mean hurry up, make it snappy. But what he actually said had a meaning above and beyond his intention. It had manifest meaning. It literally made make it crappy. It meant make it shitty. We explained this to him and he was mortified, poor guy. So this idea of manifest meaning is the idea that a film can have meaning that was not intended to be there and has nothing to do with the intentions of the filmmaker. And in fact, the meaning is, just like the meaning of the words make it crappy, the manifest meaning is based on cultural understandings of the significance of what's in the movie. So in other words, now notice that this opens the door to a kind of, first of all, it does suggest that there's objective meanings, because I can say the meaning is there. It's not up to me to find. It's not up to the person, the filmmaker, to intend. It's just there because of facts about how symbols work in our culture. So on the one hand, it's kind of objective. There's meaning there to be discovered that is independent of and nothing to do with the intentions of people involved. But on the other hand, it's based on facts about the cultural context in which this is viewed. So a movie could be transferred to another culture and it could have another meaning, and it actually could have another meaning because of facts about that culture. I remember that Dong Wu's favorite movie was Dead Poets Society. It really spoke to him. And I think that was because of it kind of mirrored the very strict Korean schooling. And it would be someone like the Robin Williams teacher character in Dead Poets Society would have been such a godsend to him in his in his rather strict upbringing that he found it very moving. So there's an example, I think, of where you can, if you transfer a film to a different culture, it could have a different manifest meaning. Now, what Wilson suggests as an alternative to the exegetical method of film interpretation, that is sort of in keeping with this idea of manifest meaning, is we understand a movie by understanding the motives and beliefs of the characters. So in other words, we watch a movie and we make sense of the movie in terms of the way the characters interact. Now, this sounds an awful lot like what was his name? Bordwell described as the overt, the comprehension, the overt explicit meaning. Whereas what Wilson says is maybe Bordwell was wrong to separate what he called comprehension and explicative interpretation, as saying separating explicit and implicit meaning. Maybe a sophisticated understanding of what's going on in the movie is the implicit message. So now what this does is it takes away the general lesson. So the exegetical method of interpretation says this movie has a message to convey. It wants to teach a general lesson to all mankind. Whereas this method that Wilson is suggesting says no, a movie is a movie about, it is about the people involved, it's not about all mankind, and it means what the movie, what the characters mean. It means you understand the movie when you get the dynamic of how all the characters are interacting. And this is the extended example from Shadow of Doubt, where there's this interplay of younger Charlie has this ring to convey to older Charlie. Older Charlie sees the ring, conveys to younger Charlie, yes, I see what you're saying to me, and I know that you're threatening to reveal that I'm the Merry Widow murderer, so I'm going to leave town, and that'll get me off the hook, right? So there's this sort of very subtle interplay that somebody just, half watching the movie would miss entirely. But a good interpretation of the movie gets all the subtle interplay and offers, well, is younger Charlie kind of complicit because she's letting older Charlie get away? She's agreeing to let him get on the train rather than reporting him to the police. Incidentally, Shadow of a Doubt, great movie. I put a link to it on Blackboard. It's Hitchcock's actual favorite of his movies, which probably would surprise most people because it's not as famous as The Birds or Vertigo and or any of those. But Joseph Cotton, who plays Uncle Charlie, the Merry Widow murderer, does an amazing evil character, which is unusual for him because he normally played good guys. Okay, so in this example, an interpretation of the movie, Charlie's behavior with the ring raises questions like, did she intend to let him go? Is she complicit with him in that respect? And so behavior in a movie, people do things that raise questions, and the job of the interpretation of the movie is to answer these questions. So why did Charlie do that? The interpretation answers that in terms of the character's motivations. So what Wilson calls this is narrative meaning. So you explain your interpretation of a movie gives its narrative meaning. Why did so-and-so do this? And that's the kind of thing that people argue about, as like in The Lord of the Rings. Why didn't they just get the eagles to carry them all the way to Mount Doom right in the beginning? Why did they trudge all that way? When clearly the eagles can rescue them at the end, why didn't they get the eagles to carry them in the first place? Motivational questions like that. Now, the narrative meaning, I think that reveals a danger with this, because sometimes the answer to that is bad writing. Why didn't they do that? Because the writer didn't think of it. Like, for example, another problem in one of the Harry Potter movies, The Prisoner of Azkaban, J.K. Rowling introduces the ideas of these time spinners or time turners. Basically, they allow you to time travel. That is a terrible thing to introduce, because once you've introduced that, you can solve any problem. Actually, that's one of the things in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. They show you what you can do with time travel. Like, they need a set of keys. And one of them says to the other, oh no, we need the keys. And they say, well, I'll travel back in time, get the keys, and then I'll put them behind that bush. And then they go and look behind the bush, and there are the keys. So it's a way to solve any problem. It's like a lot of people point out that a lot of old movies, key plot points wouldn't work now because everyone has smartphones. Which is why I think a lot of movies are being set in the 90s or 80s pre-smartphones, because it's very hard to write a good story with smartphones. Anyway, so what I'm illustrating here is that sometimes your interpretation will say, well, why didn't the characters do that? And you'll come up with some amazing explanation, when it's just that the screenwriter didn't think of it, or it was a mistake. And actually, what Wilson points out about narrative meaning is that Charlie's actions can be made sense of in ways never intended by Hitchcock. So that's one feature of narrative meaning. Now, he doesn't see that as a problem. He just says that's another feature of the interpretation. Also, there can be more than one narrative meaning. Different people can offer different interpretations. And because there's no arbiter, like the filmmaker, to settle it, because it's not the filmmaker who settles it, it's the interplay of the characters, there's no way to say this interpretation is better than that interpretation. And finally, there are some movies that just don't lend themselves to this, because they are very the plotting is not tightly constructed. People do weird things, and the films of David Lynch are notorious for this. Mulholland Drive, as you will see. If you watch Mulholland Drive, one thing you should know is the first half of the movie was the pilot for a TV series. So Mulholland Drive was going to be a TV series, like, of course, Twin Peaks. But then whoever it was, I think it was ABC, whoever it was who did Twin Peaks, said, nah, we don't want to do it. They dropped out. So David Lynch had this hour that he was really proud of, that he's really pleased with, and he wanted to and it was supposed to be the beginning of a whole long series. So there were lots of things introduced that you could then develop over a long series. But then the money went away. He wanted to use it, so he said, I'll make it into a film. So he just wrapped everything up with the second half. And as you'll notice, if you watch it, there's a big difference between the first and the second half. The first half seems to be a lot more plotted. The second half is, well, batshit crazy. And Mulholland Drive is pointed to as a movie that it is hard to interpret in the narrative way. So how do we interpret something like Mulholland Drive, asked Wilson? Well, we ask, why did the director do this? Why the stylized lighting? So it seems like we're back to actual intentionalism. Now, he does say that you can judge, because it's a problem if narrative meaning allows a bazillion different interpretations and there's no way to say that one is better than the other. Well, he says particular interpretations are constrained by the context. So, for example, this is like the difference between Mary Poppins and The Children. In The Children, you interpret the incidents as horrific because of the lighting, because of the way it's cut and the music. In Mary Poppins, it's a light-hearted children's movie because of the way because of the context and the music. So certain interpretations are ruled out by other elements of the movie. All right, so that's interpretation. Now let's look at Meskin's authorship. Now you can see this is connected with what Wilson was talking about, because as we've seen, there's the auteur theory of cinema, which is the idea that somebody, this is how Meskin introduced it. The auteur theory says, just as the author stands in relation to his or her writing in literature, so there is a figure, there is an entity that stands in that relationship to a film. So just as the author constructs and it is responsible for a work of literature in many different ways. So, for example, if it's a racist work of literature, we can blame the author. We can say, the author, you are racist. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have racist characters. And as we know, you can have a non-racist author have racist characters in their book precisely to illustrate their racism. This is a problem, for example, with Huckleberry Finn, which is a wonderful book, but has a lot of people saying the N-word and, behaving reprehensibly. But that doesn't mean that Mark Twain was endorsing that. In fact, he wanted to bring it to light and reveal the ridiculousness of this behavior. So you've got to be careful. But if the intent of a work seems to be racist, like the Turner Diaries, there's this thing called the Turner Diaries, which is popular in white nationalist and white supremacist circles, which is this fictional work of this guy. It's his diary throughout a race war, and it is popular reading amongst people who shoot up mosques and things like that. The writer of that is pretty clearly a racist. It's a racist text, and we can blame the author of that work. I don't know if people know who did write it, but whoever it did, it has a clearly racist and obnoxious intent, and we can blame that on the author. Similarly, says Auteur Theory, if a film is objectionable, like, for example, Triumph of the Will, which is a very famous very proficient and very impressive movie produced at the behest of Goebbels, presenting a rally by Hitler that, you know, is supposed to stir loyalty to Hitler and impress, supposed to make you impressed by the might of the Third Reich, and does so in a very impressive way. It's an amazing piece of propaganda, in other words. According to the Auteur Theory, that kind of very dubious fascistic content can be blamed on whoever is the author of that movie. And if you take the Auteur Theory seriously, it's the director, who is this woman called Leni Riefenstahl, who was a very controversial figure, because everybody had to say this movie is genius. It's incredibly moving and powerful, but it's a work of fascist propaganda. So people were very torn to her, because she continued to live long after World War II. She died, I think, in the 90s, or maybe she lived even longer. And she made other movies, but that movie haunted her for good reason. Okay. So the question that Meskin is interested in is, are film directors enough like literary authors that we can borrow our best literary theories of authorship and apply them to cinema and identify film directors as standing in the author role? Now, Truffaut and this guy called Saris both say yes, and they're the auteur theorists. Against this idea, as we've already seen, is that directors are not the only significant figures. For example, you know, actors like Brando, writers like Charlie Kaufman, producers, David O. Selznick. In the old days, producers were the most significant figures, and it's still true to this day that if a picture wins Best Picture at the Oscars, it's the producer who gets the award. And of course, studios. Like I mentioned Universal Studios, this Meskin mentions Hammer, which is a great British film studio which in the 50s produced much gorier Technicolor versions of the Universal monster movies, starring my Uncle Pete, Peter Cushing. Well, he's actually no relation as far as I know, but I like to think he is. And of course, Christopher Lee, who played Dracula and Frankenstein's monster and The Mummy in all of those movies. So Hammer turned out a whole slew of these movies that had a definite style. So it seems like the studio had more to do with the content and nature of the product than any individual director, because they just sort of hired directors and say, follow the house style. There were some great directors in Hammer, so that actually auteur theorists would point to, there are some movies that are better than others, and there are particular directors, and it's slipping my mind, but there's one director in particular who was very well thought of in Hammer. Even though Hammer movies were kind of schlocky, they were good in their way, and some Hammer movies are a lot better than others. So that's one criticism, is that many other figures seem to be candidates to stand in the author role. And the other criticism is that film is not like literature. You can't really say that there's an analogy. For one thing, there's no language of cinema, whereas the language of writing, you don't just write in a language like English, you write in a stylistic language. Like if you read Henry James, it's very florid, very long sentences. Contrast that with Mark Twain, very short and punchy and modern. You can instantly tell the style. Mark Twain had a good jibe about Henry James. He said, a library with no books in it is still a good library because it contains no Henry James. And Henry James can be hard to get through, although he has some people who champion him. And he famously wrote The Turn of the Screw, which is a great ghost story. All right, some pros of this idea of authorship is some directors really do seem like authors. Like Hitchcock, like David Lynch, like Kurosawa, like Ingmar Bergman, sorry. All of these great directors do seem to produce distinctive works. You can tell that it's a Bergman film, or it's a Kurosawa film, or it's a Osu film. Or the directors that Truffaut, who propounded the Auteur Theory, picked out were Jean Renoir. He was a French director in the 30s in particular, who produced a couple of movies that regarded as among the greatest ever made, particularly The Rules of the Game. Robert Bresson, I think Robert Bresson's style is very distinctive too. There's movies I've seen, Pickpocket and A Man Escaped. A Man Escaped is very simple story. Actually, he always tells very simple, plain stories, and he always casts people that aren't actors, and he makes them repeat and repeat and repeat what they're doing until it's just, comes out of them naturally. So if you watch his movies, they're very distinctive in style, and it's all, you can tell a Bresson movie. So it makes sense that Truffaut would identify Bresson as an auteur, someone whose work is recognizable like an author's work is recognizable. Another couple were Jean Cocteau, who a great movie of his is Beauty and the Beast. If you watch his version of Beauty and the Beast, it's very kind of disturbing and magical. It is meant to be a children's movie, but there's a lot going on. And he's also, was he partly responsible for Un Chien Andalou? I can't remember. And Max Ophuls. So these are all French language directors that Truffaut identifies as auteurs, and then Saris identifies Flaherty, John Ford, who we've seen The Searchers by, Howard Hawks, he did The Big Sleep, for example, Hitchcock, everybody knows Hitchcock, and Buster Keaton, who some of you watched The General, which is regarded as a very great movie. Okay, now, so we've seen those are so Auteur Theory presents this idea that films are like works of literature, and the authors of the films are the directors. There are Meskin considers criticisms of this idea, and he starts out by dismissing some fairly robust criticisms. So here are the robust criticisms and his dismissals of them, starting on page 15. First, the idea that authorship is a misplaced notion to a product of consumer culture, like a movie. Movie is popular culture, whereas and popular culture products don't have authors. So it's as if saying, so this criticism says saying a movie has an author is like saying a car has an author. They're both products of a giant system that is designed to make money. Or like I assume another analogy would be like a video game has an author. Like, does Fortnite or God of War or whatever, or any of those shooting games, do they have an author? Now, of course, in response to that, you can say, well, there are indie games that definitely do have an author, and there's a good movie about this called Indie Game the Movie that looks at particular indie games, like one called Braid and one called Fez, that are the products of sort of individual ideas. But as far as a Hollywood movie, like, I don't know, Avengers Endgame, does that really have an author? That's like saying, a Toyota Camry has an author. It's the product of a huge system. Now, so that's the criticism. In response to that, Meskin just says, well, that's a bad analogy. Film production is not like car production. You can have, and I think actually what I just said about computer games. Yeah, sure, some computer games, it would be odd to say that they had an individual author, like the latest FIFA World Cup game. Who authored that? It's based on a soccer it's so much driven by outside forces, it doesn't seem to be a product of an author. But there's a million little indie games that are quirky that really are the product of their authors. So dismiss that. You can't just say that no movie has an author because they're products of consumer culture. Second criticism. Look, this is genealogical. It says look at the source of the word. The word author is not applied to movies. Nobody says the author of a movie. And as Meskin says, yeah, well, this is a stupid worry. Doesn't matter. Films are relatively recent. Maybe people will. And after all, well, Truffaut does, because he uses the French word for author. So, you know, just looking at the way we use words is silly. Third criticism that he's going to dismiss is Stephen Heath's ideological worry. Now, this ties back, I think, to the symptomatic meaning idea that we looked at in the last article, where this says we explain a movie by looking at the forces that gave rise to it. So, for example, like you might say, film noir was a product of a time like around World War II, at a time where, you know, all of these cultural forces were at work, the death of God and all that business. So film noir, any film noir is a product of these forces, not the individual author, but these outside forces. Stephen Heath says that's the kind of thing that we should be doing, and if we focus on the director, we'll be ignoring this important socio-political factors. And I think Meskin says, well, why not have both? I understand there's a meme that's just started around a little girl saying, why not both? So feel free to insert that here. You know, we can look at both of them. Yes, it's true that film noir is a product of a time and place, but that doesn't mean that, you know, all film noirs are the same. Out of the Past is a work of genius. You know, Kiss Me Deadly is not so much. It's pulpy and it's fun, but it's not a work of genius. You know, Maltese Falcon, great. DOA, fun, but not on the same level. And the difference is the director. So why can't we look at both? The fourth skeptical argument is the death of the author. This was a movement in literature where, so this is not an argument that says, yes, we have authors in literature, but we don't have them in cinema. This death of the author idea was saying we shouldn't even focus on authors in literature. This is by French philosophers Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault. They both propounded this idea that the author is dead. What they mean is that when you look at a text, you should never wonder what the author thought. So, for example, it's very common, or it used to be very common, for people to say, how should we understand, say, Frankenstein? Well, let's look at Mary Shelley's life. Let's look at the biography of Mary Shelley and find out what was making her tick, what she was worried about. This death of the author approach says, no, that's stupid. We don't care about that. It's not just that she's dead, because they meant this even for living authors, that once they have produced the work, they're gone. It's like their baby is now out in the world, and you don't ask them about their baby. Their baby has its own features. And this is tied to the idea of manifest meaning, that the meaning is there to be discovered, and it doesn't matter what they intended to put in there, their intentions are irrelevant. So in other words, when you focus on interpretation or criticism, it is totally wrong to talk about biographical features of the author or to wonder if the author was insane or something like that. And I think that's an important movement, and it was a very influential movement, but it's certainly the case that even Foucault agreed that the authorial role still existed, and we can talk about the author. The fifth criticism that Meskin is rejecting is that there's a normative aspect of this death of the author idea. So the death of the author idea is just that we shouldn't. This normative aspect is we would be better off if there was no notion of authorship. Because what Foucault says, this idea of authorship, that someone is in charge of the meaning of a piece of literature, that is the author, what that does is it cuts off a variety of different proliferation of meaning, is the way Foucault put it. In other words, if we say the meaning of a piece of work, the only person who gets to say the meaning of a piece of work is the person who wrote it, then that cuts off various interpretations that other people could have given it that disagree with the author. And Foucault suggests that that's a bad thing. We want proliferation of meaning. But Meskin says, well, actually one thing is we can have narrative meaning as well, and narrative meaning is independent of the author, so we can have that as well. And also, how valuable is proliferation of meaning? The worries we were having earlier of, do we really want it to be the case that you can project any meaning you want? Like, again, my example of Margaret Thatcher's interpretation of the Good Samaritan. I just think some interpretations should be cut off. Some proliferation is bad. All right, the next part of Meskin is reasons why cinematic authorship might matter. And he gives these reasons: evaluation, interpretation, style, and legal and moral aspects. Okay, so let's quickly go through them. Evaluation. To evaluate a work of art is in part to evaluate the achievement of the artist. So we need an author of a movie in order to help us evaluate the movie. It's almost and it's almost always the case, he points out, that bad directors make bad films. There's a famously bad director called Uwe Boll. What does he make? One movie he made was House of the Dead or something, which was based on a video game. And every movie this guy made, he's supposed to be like the worst director ever. And every movie he makes is bad. Of course, they also said that about what's his name? The movie of his life was directed by Tim Burton. It's the best movie that Tim Burton made, and it's the best acting job that Johnny Depp did. And I'm going to see now because I can't remember his name, but he's a famously bad director who did Plan 9 from Outer Space and Glenn or Glenda. But actually those movies have their defenders, particularly Glenn or Glenda, which is an early plea for transgender acceptance. So, maybe you could criticize this. Maybe you can produce trash works. Oh, The Room. People love The Room. This is this famously bad movie. The Disaster Artist is a recent movie about it. And people love that movie. Now, are they loving it ironically, or can you say there's genuine good to be found in it? Anyway, so Meskin is suggesting that cinematic authorship matters because without an author, you can't evaluate a movie in the same way. In fact, the establishment of film as art required the notion of authorship. Truffaut had a lot to do with this elevation of movies into the pantheon of the arts. In the early 20th century, actually the same thing's happening with video games now. In like the 90s, if you'd said a video game is a work of art, people would have laughed at you. Nowadays, it's much more acceptable to say that you can have a genuine work of art that's a video game. Same with movies. Movies in the early part of the 20th century were just seen as trash, like comic books. Comic books is another thing. When comic books were around in the 50s, everyone regarded them as trash. Now you have graphic novels, and they're become accepted. All of this elevation can only happen because of a few highly regarded creators, like Alan Moore, for example, had a lot to do with the elevation of the comic book. He wrote Watchmen and V for Vendetta and stuff like that, and it's because of superstars like him and guys like Grant Morrison and other people like that who have elevated the comic book. So it is the figures that enable us to say that these things become works of art. Okay, another importance for authorship in movies is interpretation. We've had a whole article on that. Of course, that requires the view of the intentionalist. You only need the author to interpret a movie if you have an intentionalist, whereas the anti-intentionalist, or for example Wilson's narrative meaning view, you don't really need an author so much. And in that section on page 18 of Meskin, he talks about the implied author, which is like the hypothetical author that we saw in Wilson's view. Style. Some film styles, for example realism, are independent of the director, but other than that, style is definitely the fingerprints of the author. You know a David Lynch movie when you see it. You know a Robert Bresson movie when you see it. You know an Otsu movie, Yoshiro Otsu movie, when you see it. There are movies, Hitchcock, and actually that's the difference between auteurs and metteur en scène. Hitchcock, Hitchcock lived long enough that he made a variety of movies, but they all have the same kind of elements like lighting, and they're constructed very beautifully. Tim Burton, you always know you're watching a Tim Burton movie because it's got white face paint everywhere. Now that's a bad aspect of it, but the metteurs en scène, actually the example that Truffaut gave was Huston. Now John Huston is regarded as a very good director, and he directed, of course, Maltese Falcon and Asphalt Jungle, but he doesn't have a distinctive style. And I think somebody else that you could lump in with here is Billy Wilder, who directed amazing movies like Sunset Boulevard and Double Indemnity and Some Like It Hot. I mean, great movies, but didn't necessarily have the same style so that you could see it and say, oh, this is a Billy Wilder movie. What was great about Billy Wilder was more in the script, because he wrote them scripts as well. And he was more sort of the movie as a vehicle for the script, whereas other people have a definitely cinematic style, like Jacques Tourneur, who directed Out of the Past, which is one of the great film noirs, and also Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie, which are amazingly beautiful black and white horror movies. You can tell it's him because of his style. And so the style of a movie, if the movie is to have a style, it seems like it needs an author driving that style. Fourth aspect where authorship is important is legal and moral aspects. For example, this is true in literature. You own the copyright of the movie, of a work of literature, unless you sell it, and you can sue people who plagiarize you. Same with a movie. Piracy is an issue with movies, and the moral aspect is if you have a movie that has immoral aspects, you need an author to be able to blame. And so, for example, Leni Riefenstahl was blamed for the fascistic elements of Triumphs of the Will, and D.W. Griffith, otherwise regarded as a giant of early directing, is regarded as very suspect because he did some movies, most famously Birth of a Nation, that are virulently racist. Birth of a Nation celebrates the Ku Klux Klan. However, what Meskin suggests is that authorship may be fragmented. That is, you can identify different people as authors for different things. So, for example, later on in his article, he says that clearly a film scorer is artistically one of the authors of a movie. If you watch one of the spaghetti westerns, Ennio Morricone is incredibly important in making it a spaghetti western. I would say almost as much as Sergio Leone, the directors. But so as regards the movie as a work of art, he should definitely be included amongst the authors. But if a movie is, say, racist or sexist, it's much less likely that you can really blame the composer. That doesn't seem to be something that they have an influence over. So in that respect, they shouldn't be regarded as an author. So fragmented authorship is this idea that people can be identified as an author. Different people can be identified as author for different reasons. Then Meskin addresses the question, how many authors? He says you can have unauthored films that are accidentally produced, just if you set a camera up and let it roll and then showed it. There's some movies that are produced by the Factory, which the 60s art collective that, there's one of the Empire State Building that is, Andy Warhol is the guy behind the Factory. There's just a movie that is like 24 hours of a camera directed at the Empire State Building. That doesn't seem to have an author. It's accidentally produced. Then you can have individual authors, like there's this experimental or very early filmmakers who really did do everything, like Louis Lumière. That's definitely, unquestionably, an individual author. Now, already in the case of Sean Baker in that movie was it Tangerine, that he directed, that he filmed on his iPhone, already there's some question of whether he's individual authors. But these very early ones where they do everything, it's clear that they're the individual author. Now the question is, does that apply to a real Hollywood movie? But you can't question that there are some films that actually exist where you have individual authors. And there are cases where there are multiple authors. For example, the Coen brothers work very seamlessly together to produce movies. The Wachowski siblings, they started out as brothers, then both of them transitioned, so now they're sisters. I don't know how they did both transition. They did the Matrix, of course, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. And then there's the brothers Key, Quay, who are a Czech kind of plasticine molding animation collective. And then, of course, there's movies that have different sections, like Twilight Zone the movie, or Creepshow the movie, or New York Stories. They're popular in horror in particular, like the VHS. There's a couple of movies called VHS and VHS 1 where they have different sections, each of which is directed by a different director. The ABCs of Death was a movie that had 26 little movies, all each of them devoted to a different letter, and each of them directed by a different director. So clearly those movies have multiple authors, because each section within them has a different author. But is any one of those theories, individual author, multiple author, or unauthored, applicable to a standard Hollywood movie? The single author supporters say yes, you can still say it's a single author, just as you talk of a single author of a work, like Raymond Carver famously wrote short stories, and he's identified as the author of those short stories, even though, equally famously, he had a very influential editor who really worked with him and forced him to change his work and edited it and sent it back, so collaborated. But even though this guy Gordon Lish was very important, and the stories wouldn't be the way they are if it wasn't for Gordon Lish, Raymond Carver is regarded as the sole author. So Livingston says collectively produced doesn't mean jointly authored. So you can have a single author of a collectively produced item, say the single author hypothesis fans. For example, another one of these is a guy called Perkins on page 22, who says directors synthesize and are therefore in charge of what makes a film a film. Obviously the composer makes the music, but the director puts the music into the whole. So the director is molding this whole out of parts. Each of the parts can be made by someone else, but the whole collective is shaped by the director. So therefore the fact that the parts are made by different people doesn't stop the director as being responsible for the whole. That's what the single author hypothesis people say. Bordwell and Thompson say the directors control shooting and assembly phases, the shooting schedule and the editing, which crystallize the form and style. It's cutting the movie together that really makes it into the movie. And as we've said, as the auteur theorists point out again and again, there are repeating structures in movies by the same director that are distinctive, so that we can tell that this one director produces that structure. Even when they're working with different people, they produce that structure. So Bergman, for example, worked with different cinematographers in his movies, but each movie is his. He worked with different actors, he worked with different composers, but it's always him that produces the movie. This is the single author hypothesis. Whereas this guy Beres Gout questions the single author hypothesis. He says the director's control is not like an architect's control, and therefore doesn't establish sole authorship. Now Gout includes the actors as authors, because clearly they're important, and as has often been pointed out, directors can hire an actor and think that the actor is going to do one thing, and then the actor will do something totally different, and the director will say, wow, that's much better than what I thought, do that. So clearly the actor is putting their stamp on the movie, and so Gout suggests that they should be counted as authors too. In response to that, in criticism of that, Meskin says this kind of reasoning would mean that the people who pose for photographs should be counted as authors of the photographs. But that's ridiculous. The author of a photograph is the photographer, not the person being photographed. Then Meskin, on page 23, goes into the question of are the film authors real or constructed? So this is, again, this idea of the hypothetical filmmaker, or the hypothetical intentions of the implied filmmaker. In favor of this idea, it explains the unity of a film that has no single actual author, but this assumes a single implied author. Why assume a single implied author? Why not assume a bunch of implied authors? What are the rules of what makes an implied author? It points out that this is kind of a dubious notion. And Meskin also says the motivation for implied authors in some cases is, for example, to exonerate D.W. Griffith of racism, because apparently D.W. Griffith didn't appear to be a racist guy in his regular life. Charlie Chaplin, for example, who was a very lefty kind of guy, worked with D.W. Griffith. They formed United Artists together. It seems like he hung around with liberal people. So it would seem odd that he was as virulently racist as his movie, as certainly Birth of a Nation appears to be. So one defense of D.W. Griffith is to say, well, the real person D.W. Griffith is not the author of Birth of a Nation, it's D.W. Griffith, the implied author, the author in role. So that was one argument for the implied authors. And what Meskin says is, if that's your motivation for implied author is just to get D.W. Griffith off the hook, an easier way to say is that people are different in different contexts. You know, some people are brave on, like you can get shy actors who are amazingly brave and revealing on stage, but cripplingly shy on a one-to-one basis. People are just different in different contexts. Why invent this implied author business for that? And another problem is, part of the importance of having an author is to explain. And why does an author explain the nature of a work? It's because the author produced the work, is causally responsible. Without the author actually writing or actually filming the work, it wouldn't exist. But that's not true of an implied author. An implied author literally doesn't exist, so they can't be responsible for an existing film. So it kind of undercuts one of the important roles of authorships. And finally, Meskin suggests we should expand our notion of authorship in a couple of ways. we should look into the joint authorship which is accepted in scientific journals. If you ever look at a scientific article, it can have double digits authors, and the order that they're listed in is in some sense important. So consequently, this actually comes up when you are assessing the importance of somebody's publication record for tenure in academia. So for example, someone who works in physics could produce like 30 articles in 1 year, but they would be like 10th author on all of them. And then the question is, how much did you actually contribute to that? And it's a real question. Whereas in philosophy, it's rare to have more than one person responsible, and they write it entirely themselves. So if they produce an article, it's the sweat of their brow and required hundreds of hours of work. Whereas like being 10th author on a scientific paper might not have required anything other than saying, yeah, I like that. You can put my name on it. I hope no scientist watches this and sues me. Well, if they get to 1 hour 35 minutes in, well, then they deserve to be able to sue me. So that's one suggestion in Meskin for expanding the idea of authorship. We should look more into this idea of multiple authors. And again, return to this idea that he mentioned earlier, that authorship can be fragmented. And here's where he talks about the composer, where they can be co-author artistically, but not morally. There, we're done. That's the end of the 7th unit. And there are only 7th unit, well, 8 if you count unit 0. So if you've watched this to the end, congratulations, and I hope you got something out of this class.